Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased as well as honoured to be invited to give this first lecture in memory of our colleague Levtzion, although I have a confession to make. My acquaintance with him goes back to the time when I first entered the School of Oriental and African Studies as a research student in 1966. My engagement with his work to the time of my appointment as lecturer in the history of North Africa in 1970. In 1972-3, I contributed to the seminar which he arranged at the school on the subject of conversion to Islam, out of which came the volume Conversion to Islam that appeared in 1979. My own contribution, however, on the conversion of Egypt to North Africa was not published, partly because I had worked the material into a chapter for the Cambridge History of Africa, but partly because I was dissatisfied with the conclusion. Many questions remained to be answered. Some 25 years later, I first accepted, but finally declined a second invitation to contribute to the history of Islam in Africa in view of my other commitments. Today, over 30 years later, in this memorial lecture, I hope to remedy both of those omissions with the help of that familiar pair, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, community and society, how the one grew into the other, but the other gave rise to the one. Islam, Bernard Lewis used to tell his students, is a great deal more than a religion. It is a way of life and a civilization. To convey this comprehensive meaning, Marshall Hodgson coined the word Islamdom as a match for Christendom, a world named for its faith. The term has not caught on, although it has the merit of shifting the emphasis from the religion to the civilization. Merit from the historian's point of view, because it transforms Islam from a thing in itself into the series of beliefs and activities of Muslims across the centuries, on the principle that the history of the subject is the subject. From that point of view, as Geertz observed when looking at Islam at either end of the Islamic world in Java and Morocco, the salient feature is plurality, religions, ways of life, and civilizations that all go under the same name. This is not to suggest that they have nothing in common apart from the name, as the French were wont to do in North Africa, and as Muslims themselves may sometimes feel. Students of mine have been known to denounce the forms of Islam studied by Geertz as paganism. It is simply to acknowledge the many ways in which different peoples at different times have subscribed to the religion quite literally in good faith, and the equally many ways in which they have differed and disagreed. The Qadi, who entertained Ibn Battuta in the presence of his wife, smilingly replied to his guest's expression of shock that such was the custom, part of the way of life of this particular Muslim community. The problem is to explain how that community had come into being as part of a wider Islamic society to whose development it contributed. Historians may not believe in the miraculous origins of Islam or of any other faith, but the evolution of its civilization out of what John Wansbrough called the sectarian milieu of late antiquity is nevertheless a remarkable phenomenon. The sectarian milieu was an aspect of the society of the Near East at the time of the Prophet, but within 200 or 300 years of the Hijrah, the society in question had been transformed into that of Islam by the energy of the faithful who established their community at Mecca in 622 of the Common Era. If we think of the Arab conquest as an astronomical Big Bang, the origin of an expanding universe, the Trinitarian belief in God, prophet, and book has acted rather as a black hole, a center of gravity that has attracted other ways of life and thought into a galaxy that is by now far wider than the original Arab Empire, and much more varied than its already complex society. The attraction is all the greater for its enactment on the ground. Every year the faithful are drawn back, physically in space and mentally in time, to the point of origin of the belief at Mecca. It was in this way that Ibn Battuta came to trace the outreach of his faith across the surface of the globe, as he moved in from the west and out to the north, the east and the south, over a period of some 30 years in the first half of the 14th century of the Common Era. The accounts of his travels bears witness to the conversion of rulers in Central Asia, of government in India, and of population in East Africa, as the pagan Mongol Khans of the Golden Horde professed the faith, as the sultans of Delhi conquered much of the subcontinent, and as the growth of trade in the Indian Ocean led to the formation of the Swahili, the Muslim people of the East African coast. Conversion, in the sense of a changeover from one system to another, is a suitably impersonal term for the growth of the original community of the faithful into the society of the lands it had conquered, and for the subsequent establishment of Islamic societies beyond the boundaries of the original empire. As a statement of fact, it reduces the element of personal choice in the matter of faith to one among many such factors in the process. In referring to Ibn Battuta and his witness to the expansion of Islam, I have used conversion for political, administrative, and demographic change, but not at all in the sense it may have in Islam as well as Christianity, of embracing a new religion out of personal conviction. If we ourselves go back in space and time from the periphery of the Islamic world, in the first half of the 14th century CE, to the period of its formation in the lands conquered by the Arabs between the 7th and the 10th century CE, the meaning is just as factual. When the Arab Empire finally vanished in 945 of the Common Era, conversion was evidently widespread. Rulers were Muslim, government and administration had been Islamized, and those who professed the faith were well on their way to becoming the great majority of the population. To describe this conversion of an original minority into a majority, and the previous majority into a minority, Bullitt reduced the process to a statistical curve, ingeniously derived from a sample of ancestral names to be found in the biographical dictionaries that multiplied from the 10th century onwards. The paper on the subject, which he delivered to the seminar at the School of Oriental and African Studies in 1972-3, was a major contribution to the subsequent volume, Conversion to Islam. But the length of the curve differed from country to country, representing a slower rate of conversion in Egypt than, for example, in Iran. The sample may have been limited and hence inadequate. The various graphs, however, provide a working hypothesis that prompts the question, what were the mechanisms at work in each country to explain the formation of an Islamic society out of the initial community of believers? There is certainly a common denominator. Whatever the point at which we examine Richard Bullitt's S-shaped curve of conversion, that it rises upwards from the minimum to the maximum percentage of the population in question, that population was divided between members and non-members of the Muslim community. By the same token, the division was determined by the criteria of admission and exclusion that prevailed at that particular time. At the time of the Arab conquest and the formation of the Arab Empire, the criteria of membership were both racial and religious. The Arabs as distinct from non-Arabs, believers as distinct from unbelievers. The equivalence of Arabs with believers in the original community of the mu'minun, or faithful, was unsustainable. From the very beginning, it may have been more of an ideal than a reality. But the selectivity imposed by this racial and religious elitism upon the entry of non-Arabs into the community governed the ways in which the various peoples of the empire were eventually converted to the religion, the society, and the civilization of Islam. Whereas in Egypt, the land of the Copts, the believers were predominantly Christian. In North Africa, the Berbers were considered to be largely pagan. While Christians, once conquered, were obliged to remain Christian in exchange for the payment of a poll tax, pagans were not only required to submit to the Arabs, but to profess their faith. Therein lie the roots of two very different histories. The equivalence of Arabs with believers, non-Arabs with non-believers, broke down within 100 years. Initial recruitment of non-Arabs into the armies of the faithful as Mawali Muslimun, clients who had made their submission to Arab members of the community, created a class of non-Arab subordinates to the Arab mu'minun. Such recruitment was demographically explosive. In the townships where the armies were centered, at Fustat in Egypt, for example, the community proceeded to grow by natural reproduction to the point at which it had outgrown the army that the state was prepared to support. Early in the 8th century CE in Egypt, the names of the Arab warriors entitled to pay were listed in a diwan, a register. The final step was taken early in the 9th, when these Arabs were removed from the payroll altogether. What then remained was a nomadic population of Arab tribesmen in the desert and a civilian population of subjects rather than rulers in the cities, in particular Fustat. For these believers, the term Muslim had become the standard appellation in place of mu'min, which survived in its original sense chiefly in the title of the Caliph, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or Commander of the Faithful. 500 years later, Ibn Khaldun took a gloomy view of this development, observing that the Arabs of the third race, who had followed the Prophet, had been swallowed up in the mass of the people they had conquered, leaving the Bedouin, who had remained in the desert, to develop into a fourth race of uncivilized nomads. That was not how it appeared at the time to the thriving Egyptian community of Muslims in various walks of life, governed by Muslim rulers and living under the law of Islam. The establishment of their community was celebrated in the 9th century by the jurist Ibn Abd al-Hakam, who wrote an account of the conquest of Egypt and North Africa, and in the 10th by El-Kindi, whose governors and judges of Egypt related the subsequent history of the country under the names of those appointed to the principal offices of state: the Wali, or governor on behalf of the Caliph, and the Qadi, or judge on behalf of the law. The diarchy of these two officers defined the community just as its faith was defined by the law, as defined by the scholars over the past 200 or 300 years. In similar fashion, the two Christian communities were defined by their churches, of which the Coptic Patriarchate was the more important. The history of the Coptic Patriarchs of Alexandria, compiled in the second half of the 11th century CE, matched the work of Al-Kindi as a narrative of the reigns of successive patriarchs that told the other side of the story, a history of adversity and decline. What we see from these works is the conversion of a Christian into an Islamic society, as the Muslim community grew into the great majority of the population, while its counterpart turned from a nation into the community of a minority. Such an outcome had been effectively accomplished by the time of the compilation of the history of the patriarchs and was complete by the end of the Mamluk period. The problem is that the evidence is lacking for the way in which this transformation was accomplished. The judgment of Ibn Khaldun, that a nation which falls under the rule of another will quickly perish, is a generalization that not only begs the question, but is qualified in the case of Egypt by the survival of Christianity down to the present day, a point to be borne in mind. For the early centuries, the conversion of Christians into Muslims was conspicuous by its absence, as D.C. Dennett observed when arguing against the familiar thesis that there was a rush to convert to avoid the poll tax. Down to the end of the Umayyad period in 750, the association between the profession of faith and admission into the community of the faithful as a client of the Arabs restricted recruitment in Egypt to a few high officials in the administration. But the same was true in reverse. To be a member of the church was to be the member of a society whose ties were not easily broken, even after conditions of entry into Islam were relaxed in the Abbasid period. No great conversion of Christians into Muslims is attested, except at the beginning of the 11th and the 14th century, when it resulted from two extraordinary bouts of persecution. The ties themselves persisted despite the decline in numbers down to the 19th century, when the community began to increase in the context of the overall growth in population. This demographic upsurge, which means that the Christian community of Egypt today is now more numerous than it was when it formed the total population of the country, is a second point to be borne in mind when considering the explanation for the Islamization of Egypt. This emphasis on the resistance of Egyptian Christians to conversion is the reverse of Richard Bullitt's insistence on the need for an incentive to do so in the form of some expected reward. For literate members of the Christian community, there was a strong disincentive in the form of their employment, either in the church or in the financial administration of the state. Both the Coptic Jacobite and the much smaller Orthodox Melkite Church lived off the considerable endowments of which we have a glimpse in the 12th century churches and monasteries of Egypt ascribed to Abu Saleh. Despite the proliferation of Muslim functionaries, Coptic Christians retained their old and lucrative position in government as the experts of the fiscal regime. Despite their corresponding expertise in irrigation, however, the illiterate Coptic peasants lost their monopoly of agriculture, the economic basis of government, and with it a comparable incentive to stay with the church. That loss, however, was not occasioned by the loss of members to Islam, but in the first place by their resistance to oppression by the Muslim state. Down to the beginning of the 8th century, not only did they retain their monopoly, but in the words of the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, they had never had it so good. Provincial Coptic governors had connived to keep the tax burden low by failing to enter peasants who had moved from their native village onto the tax list of the village where they had settled, so that the taxes of those who were on the list were shared among a greater number of cultivators. When this practice was stopped, migrants were sent back to their villages and the tax burden was increased. The consequence was 100 years of sporadic Coptic peasant revolt that ended only in 832. Writing in the 15th century, El-Makrizi was right to say that after 832 the Muslims were in control of the villages, but not that they were in a majority. The phrase "Ghalaba el-Muslimun al-Quran" is ambiguous. Similarly, the evidence of tombstones from Aswan in the middle of the 9th century, necessarily those of an affluent minority in the far south of the country, is insufficient to substantiate the claim that this was the time when the Christian majority became the Christian minority. Ibn Hawkal's description of Egypt 100 years later is full of Coptic villages. Nevertheless, the evidence for the destruction of churches in Middle Egypt in the period of the revolts, which was accompanied by a change in the dedication of churches from otherwise unknown Egyptian saints to St. George and other familiar figures, seems proof of a widespread uprooting of the Coptic peasant population from its ancient attachment to the localities marked by the shrines of the spirits of each place. Equally significant is the fact that the final Coptic revolt was part of a much wider Arab insurgency in a period of civil war, and that 30 years after its suppression, the country witnessed a series of peasant risings in support of allied pretenders to the caliphate. El-Makrizi was thus in a way correct when he went on to say that after their defeat, the Copts turned to the oppression of the Muslim majority as tax collectors. His remark, which reflected the dislike of the Copts in his own day and age as a privileged minority, bears witness to the marginalization of the Christian community that we may think set in from the second half of the 8th century onwards, as the Christian population began to shrink. The reason for that shrinkage cannot be the loss of life entailed by the suppression of the Coptic revolts. El-Makrizi offered his own explanation when he said that the Muslims took Christian wives from Muslim offspring, which may well be true. Underlying the revolts, however, was a very long-term factor of the kind beloved of Brodel, namely the perpetual shortage of people to cultivate the available land. It was the need for peasants that induced them to migrate, that drove the state to send them back to where they had come from, and finally to offer tax concessions to those who would bring wasteland back into cultivation, an admission of failure that connived at the practice of migration that it strove to eradicate. Egypt, in other words, was underpopulated, both with regard to the land available for cultivation and with regard to the state which the land was required to support. The population was certainly small. The best estimates suggest that it fluctuated between 2 and 6 million, with an average of 4, down once again to the 19th century and the beginning of its spectacular growth in the 20th. It may well be that the peasant element in that population had a persistent tendency to fall and required a constant trickle of immigration from the desert to maintain itself. The consequences of such a demography for the conversion of Egypt to Islam are fundamental to the explanation. Within an essentially static population, let alone one with a tendency to fall, the growth of one element must necessarily be at the expense of another. Within a growing population, on the other hand, the two elements may increase together, as we see in the case of the Coptic community today. If we think, as we must, of the Muslim community as a dynamic element within the static population of medieval Egypt, the Christian community was bound to decrease to the point of equilibrium that seemed to have been reached by the time of the Ottoman conquest. No wave of conversion would be required, merely a higher versus a lower rate of reproduction, that over the centuries would bring about the repopulation of the Nile Valley by Muslims. In other words, the conversion of Egypt to Islam. One might argue about the reasons for such dynamism, including the marriage of Christian women to Muslim men, that would reduce the fertility of the Coptic community, as well as a constant trickle of individual conversions. It would certainly go back to the original formation of the Muslim community at Fustat in the 7th century. What it does is to offer some foundation for Ibn Khaldun's assertion that the nation that comes under the rule of another will perish, even when qualified by the survival of that nation as the community of a minority.